Alex Knodell is a professor at Carleton College. He's also the co-director of the Small Cycladic Island Project, which is based in the Cyclades in Greece. The Small Cycladic Island Project is one of the reasons that I wanted to do an interview with Professor Knodell because it has such a big connection to my project, which is also based in the Cyclades. Professor Knodell also has a vast experience in fieldwork, which made me interested because fieldwork comes hand in hand with cultural preservation, which is something that I'm focused on. And as you'll see in the video, Professor Knodell does his interview live from Kimolos, Greece, which is an island where he is working for the Small Cycladic Island Project. And in Kimolos and the surrounding islands, he is doing some field work, which he will talk about more in the video. Enjoy! So I guess my first question is like, what made you get into the archaeological field?
I guess I got into archaeology probably when I was about your age in high school. I wrote a research paper in a high school history class on Julius Caesar. And as I was kind of reading more and more about Julius Caesar and Roman history, I got interested in ancient history. And from there, I got into archaeology as a way to learn about and think about and study history and historical processes through material culture and through things that written sources don't tell us. Because one of the things I was struck by when I started reading a lot of ancient history is just how sort of selective these sources were, and um, how biased they were to particular perspectives, and how we didn't hear from, well, let's say the way that most people were living and kind of going about their lives.
Mhm.
So I got interested in archaeology as a way to access that, but via ancient history. And so that's how I got into Mediterranean archaeology in particular. Um, I have a kind of broader background in anthropological archaeology. I specialize in the ancient Mediterranean world, but am interested in complex societies more generally, and how different societies kind of um, work in comparable ways or not, right? And what we can
Yeah.
learn from kind of comparing different societies in very different historical and geographical and chronological contexts.
Yeah, it's archaeology tells a whole different story, I guess, right?
Yeah, and of course, I'm drawn to the outdoors aspect of it, the ability to be outside and to kind of do different things. I mean, I like working in a library and researching in a library, and that's where I do most of my research actually. But it's nice to be able to spend a couple months outside during the summer and
Yeah.
doing the field work aspect of it.
So during the rest of the year, you work at Carleton College, right?
That's right. Yeah, I teach in the classics department and direct the interdisciplinary archaeology program there.
Mm, interesting. And now moving on to the Small Cycladic Island Project. I think you guys call it SCIP, right? So
Yeah, Skip.
Skip, exactly. What is your job in this with Skip and like involved? Like what do you do there over the summer?
So I co-direct the Small Cycladic Islands Project, or Skip, as we just said we like to call it. I co-direct it with colleagues from the Effort of Antiquities of the Cyclades in Greece and the Norwegian Institute at Athens. So it's what we call a synergesia, or a collaboration.
Mm,
So it's the formal collaboration between the um, the Effort, which is the local branch of the Archaeological Service in Greece, and the Norwegian Institute and Carleton. And my co-directors on this project um, are Dimitris Athanasoulis, who's the director of the Effort, and so the overall director, and then Zarko Tankozic from the Norwegian Institute, and he's at the University of Bergen in Norway.
And specifically, like I know you guys work on like small uninhabited islands, right? Do you what specific islands do you guys work on, if you know? Um,
So we've been working on a variety of tiny uninhabited islands lately. The project started in 2019. As you said, the goal is to do a series of surface surveys and kind of systematic comparative studies of these small uninhabited islands around the Cyclades. We started in 2019, and in 2020 in the islets around Paros and Antiparos. And did you tell me that you're from Paros? So maybe
Yeah.
you're familiar
Yes.
with some
Yeah.
of them. So we started right there. We were staying in Piso Livadi. If you know it, I'm sure you do.
Nice place.
And we were working in the islets around Paros, so close to Piso Livadi. There was Rio Nisi. That's where we sort of started. And then there are a handful of islets kind of northeast of the Bay of Nausa called Rio Castro and Felizi. And then inside of the Bay of Nausa, we worked on some islets around there in 2020. Ikonomu, which is actually attached to the mainland, let's say, of Paros by a small sandbar, and then several other much smaller ones that were used during the Russian occupation of the Cyclades in the 18th century. So we're finding things from all different time periods, from prehistory all the way to the present. And the project is what we call a diachronic systematic survey, systematic surface survey. So when you're doing an archaeological survey, you don't control what you find. So you sort of have to deal with everything, right, from all different time periods. And for me, this is one of the really interesting things about doing this type of field work, because you get to tell a kind of long-term history of a place or of a region. And for us, where we're really interested is kind of doing this at an individual scale for individual little islets where we're working, but then also kind of seeing how these islets operate as part of wider systems and how that changes over time.
And for you personally, you talked about like you have to pick everything, right? Like what's your favorite discovery that you guys have made on like I don't know, just around your exploration?
I don't know if I have a favorite. I think that the most interesting for me has been the variety. What we've seen in the project so far is that these islands tend not to be occupied in the very long term, but they often have occupation for many different periods, if that makes sense. So you might have, and the type of occupation varies. So to go back to the first example we mentioned, Drionisi by Paros, on there we seem to have a small early Bronze Age settlement. Then there's a long gap in occupation. Then we have some evidence of activity, let's say, not a full settlement or anything like that, but activity on the island in the Archaic period. In the Classical period through Roman times, people seem to have been using the island as a quarry to quarry marble. And then there's some terraces that date to a later period where people are using the island for agricultural land. In between these periods and indeed up to the contemporary period, people used islands like Drionisi and probably including Drionisi to keep animals, mostly goats. Originally, we wanted to call the project the Goat Island Project, but we wanted to kind of include more different types of activities and not make it only about the goats. But there is a heavy goat presence on these islands, not only today, but also historically. We know from ancient sources, for example, from the Classical period, that small islands were sometimes used as goat islands. And then we also have, some of them have names like Dragonisi by Mykonos, which literally means goat island.
Does that ever interfere with your work, the goats just being there?
Not so directly. It's one of those situations where they're more frightened of us than we are of them.
Yeah.
So they tend to not stick around when we show up. But of course, they can't go far, which is why they're kept there in the first place.
And so once you find these artifacts, what exactly do you do with them?
So we collect pottery, stone tools, other ancient materials that we find, and then we bring them to back to the mainland where we're staying, and they're deposited in an official storeroom that's managed by the Archaeological Service, an apotheki it's called. and that could be in a museum or in a separate location. So that's where they're housed. That's where the antiquities are housed. But what we're doing is, after we collect them and deposit them in their proper place, then we're systematically studying them, going through them in order to document basically functional and chronological information about them. And this helps us kind of piece together the big picture story that we're trying to tell about these places, because we're also keeping track of the locations where everything was found. So you might see then that one part of the island was used in one way during the Bronze Age, let's say, another part was used in a different way during the Classical period, something else in Byzantine times, and so on.
And when you have all these artifacts, right, a big part of what I'm trying to do with my organization is like preserve the culture, right? So what do you guys do as well with Skip and in general as archaeologists to just preserve the culture, right? Because you don't want the fragile material shattering, for example, or you don't want to lose anything either. So what do you do?
So the artifacts will be stored kind of long term in the facilities of the Archaeological Service, but in the interim, as I said, we study them, and we study them in order to ultimately publish them and provide information about the artifacts themselves, but also the sort of bigger picture stories that they tell. As we're studying them, as I said, we look for chronological and functional information, and then we situate that in its spatial context. And we'll be publishing things in the form of articles and books. There are a couple of articles already published about the project. One in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology about our results from 2019. The other is in it's called an Antiquity Project Gallery, which is open access, and anybody can check it out. It's by myself, Dimitri Satanasoulis, Žarko Tanković, and several other of our colleagues. And that is a brief overview of our results from 2019 and 2020. So on the academic side, our goal is to sort of study these materials, publish them, use them to kind of incorporate them in wider histories of the region and archaeological studies of the region, how our results relate to the results of other projects. But there's also a preservation element that's really important. And this is where the sort of long-term storage comes in. Part of the reason for storing them in the long term in the facilities of the Archaeological Service is so that if future generations of scholars want to go back and restudy this material or check some of the interpretations that we've produced or the analyses that we've produced, there's the opportunity to do that.
So it kind of builds off each other, almost like future archaeologists can use your work for help.
Exactly. And from a cultural heritage standpoint, on surface surveys, you tend not to find the most glamorous stuff. So it's unlikely that, let's say 99% of the things that we find would ever end up in a museum display or something like that. But if we did find something that would be, worthy of a museum exhibition, then that's another way in which we could be accessing the public or presenting the results of our work to the public. More likely, the results of the project would be, say, described in a panel. As we say, we are publishing our work. We also want to present our work in a way that's public facing. So we have a website that's www.smallcycladicislandsproject.org, where we have lots of photos of the field work, some brief descriptions of what we've been doing, what the overall significance and goals of the project are, this type of thing.
And also kind of switching gears, right? I know another thing you've been working on is Mazi Archaeological Project, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's obviously in two very different regions, right? One's in mainland Athens, right? And the other's on the Cycladic Island. So what would you say is the biggest difference that you've seen in the two regions archaeologically?
Yeah, they're kind of inverses of one another.
Mm.
In that the Mazi Archaeological Project ran from 2014 to 2017. And I co-directed that with my colleague Sylvian Fichard from the Swiss School in Greece, and our colleagues from the Ephrata of Antiquities of West Attica and Piraeus. Calliope Papangali was our co-director there. As far as the kind of contrast between Mazi and the Cyclades, well, one is up in a small mountain plain northwest of Attica, and the other is on these tiny little uninhabited islands. Where I find them to overlap a little bit is that there are ways in which we can think of both types of landscape as somewhat marginal, in the sense that one of the things that interested us about Mazi was that it's located at a ancient and modern borderland between Attica and Boeotia. So one of the things that we were interested in with Mazi is how this area was kind of on the fringes of the Athenian polity on the one hand during classical times, and on the Theban polity in Boeotia on the other hand. And we knew from historical sources that there were various border disputes. We were interested in the archaeological aspect of it and the material culture angle. The area has several fortifications in it. So how does this fortification activity relate to border disputes that are both documented in ancient sources and ones that are perhaps not documented in ancient sources? This type of stuff. So, what does the countryside look like when you're out of the sort of core of these ancient poleis?
Yeah.
On the Cyclades side, obviously it's something very different, but at the same time, we're in kind of marginal spaces and also spaces that people move through. In both projects, we're interested both in kind of liminality on the one hand, connectivity on the other. So these tiny little uninhabited islets are a little bit marginal, they're somewhat isolated, but they're also highly connected whenever people are using them because they have to be. You can't just live on most of these places because there's no water, there's not very much for a food source, and certainly not very much in terms of diversity of potential food sources. So while at first they seem marginal, they also have to be highly connected, at least when they're being used. And these kind of mountainous borderlands, of which the Mazi Plain is one example, is in some way a parallel circumstance, even if the geography is kind of opposite. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, after all, it is one country, I guess. So but they're different regions, so there's both similarities and differences. So. Yeah, and then another question that's kind of not connected to archaeology, but you spent a considerable amount of time in Greece, right? What's your favorite part of Greek culture?
My favorite part of Greek culture, I'd have to say the people. I mean, I'm an archaeologist, and so I'm interested, obviously, in the history and in the material culture and archaeology. As a survey archaeologist, I'm very interested in landscape. That's one of the things that first struck me about Greece when I visited for the first time. I was just overwhelmed by these beautiful landscapes and the combination of mountains and the sea and the really powerful colors that you see. So I like all of that stuff. But what I've come to really love most about the place is the people and the friendships and the times that I've shared with colleagues, with friends, just enjoying one another's company. I would say whether that's over a meal. I also like Greek food very much.
Yeah.
Or working together on an archaeological project, or just having a nice evening out in Athens.
Yeah, it's like, I think culture is like, so it's related to archaeology to a large extent, but it's also the whole picture, like everyone's people and everything there. So
And I guess one thing I really appreciate about Greece is I find that many people, if not most people, are very interested in many different types of culture, right? So uh, I know a lot of archaeologists, but it's not as if they're only interested in archaeology or ancient history or ancient art or something like that.
Mm.
As you probably know, Athens has a really vibrant theater scene and music scene, and that's one of the things that I find just very refreshing about spending time here.
Yeah.
I love what I do professionally, and I'm very interested in that. But I find Greece in general to just be so culturally vibrant, from whether we're talking about theater and performance, or music, or food, or just kind of general intellectual conversation about books, let's say.
Yeah, and that also translates to the archaeological side, right? There's so much history. It's so vibrant, so many time periods. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so, yeah. Thank you.